Verbs are the most important of all your tools. They push the sentence forward and give it momentum. Active verbs push hard. Passive verbs tug fitfully. William Zinsser.
You're listening to Writing Roots, brought to you by Aspen House Publishing.
Welcome to Writing Roots. I'm Lee Hull.
And I'm Lee Esses. By popular request, we are once again talking about active and passive voice. We have covered this particular topic a couple of different ways in a couple of different episodes. One was back in season 26 about crippling your language. And then again, this past November, when we were talking about putting things out of order, we also addressed active and passive voice.
When it comes to this rule in particular, you will mostly hear that you need to use active voice, active voice, active voice, active voice. But we're here to let you know that sometimes passive voice is the right way to phrase your sentence. So as a reminder, a sentence is two nouns, a subject and an object, and a verb, what is happening to them. And passive voice is when the noun doing the thing is listed second instead of first.
For instance, active voice would be I baked a cake. I and cake being the nouns, baked being the verb. I was the one doing the baking, therefore I came before. That makes it an active voice sentence.
Passive would be the cake was baked by me. So you have your cake, your noun, baked, your verb, and then by me, the noun. And that second noun is the noun doing the thing.
Another easy way to identify it is a lot of those auxiliary verbs. This isn't 100% of the time, but this is generally a good indicator. We're talking about is, was, has been, by. These types of smaller verbs that attach themselves to a larger verb will be an indicator that something might be out of order. So that's a first glance, and then you can look deeper.
The reason why this rule exists is, in large part, pacing. To keep your story moving, to keep the participants in the story an active part of it. And a lot of the times we understand sentences, we understand the process of a story in the order of appearance. Especially when you use something like, the boy kicked the ball, you see a boy, and then you see him kicking the ball. But if you reverse the order, you see the ball, and it gets kicked, it starts moving, but you don't know who did it. And then suddenly you're having to edit the scene in your mind and insert the boy and see him kicking the ball.
Another reason why you'll hear a lot of industry professionals say, hey, avoid passive voice at all costs, is passive voice is used kind of as a crutch for the authors that find every sentence in the last 3 paragraphs started with your main character's pronoun. So instead of saying, I baked the cake, when every other sentence in the paragraph started with I, you'll rearrange it and go, the cake was baked by me. Therefore, I'm not starting the sentence with it, and you end up with an accidental passive voice, when that's not going to help your reader understand the story.
Also, by using by in a sentence, you create a weird addition that just makes the sentence feel long. Passive voice adds in a lot of unnecessary words to fill in the details. You just look at the difference between I baked the cake and the cake was baked by me. You have 2 whole words added to what could have been a 4-word sentence.
Another reason why you're advised against using passive voice is it does tend to make it feel like things are happening to your main character instead of your main character having agency. A lot like our opener told, there's a push and a pull and a direction of momentum. And if things are happening to your main character, they're seen as a lot weaker. They're seen as a little more uninteresting. They aren't seen as heroic because stuff is happening to them instead of them happening to things. There's also a weird emphasis placed on the verb in the sentence when you're using passive voice. We'll talk in a moment about how to use that to your advantage, but for the most part, unless we're really wanting to emphasize the verb for some reason, passive voice is not going to serve you well. So the cake was baked by me. Baked is a lot more of a priority than I baked the cake. I did the thing. I am the main character versus the baking is the point of the sentence.
In some cases, using passive voice can come off as condescending and talking down to the reader, like they don't quite understand what you're trying to say, that you're trying to over-explain things to them. And again, that can probably just go back to the fact that passive voice takes so much longer to get the point out. So it looks like you're over-explaining even though that you're saying the same thing. But it can, in some cases, such as a sentence like, the police officer wrote the ticket. If you switch that to passive voice and say, the ticket was written by the police officer, it's almost like you're assuming people don't know that they can't follow that as easily. So you are kind of leading them by the hand in the whole thing.
And in the same vein, you can lose a lot of the poetry because you have to add all of these extra little words. The rhythm of the sentence and the immersion that you get when you're reading can be lost because we're having to backpedal, because you've got a strange extra couple of tiny words that we're seeing but not in the middle of the sentence. So if you want really artistic writing that just flows and immerses the reader, passive voice is not going to serve you well.
Except sometimes it can, if it is done with a lot of intention. And that's why we want to talk about breaking this particular rule. Anytime you have a rule, a thing that you should not do, you can always use that to your advantage to convey ideas when you know how that will be interpreted by readers. As I go use passive voice. Whenever you have a rule, you can use the expectations of the reader to your advantage when you break it. So with passive voice, if you understand how they will interpret it, then you can use it to make sure the right information is emphasized.
Therefore, if the new information in the scene, in the moment, in the sentence that you're trying to create, if the new information is listed first, that will be seen as a priority. So if I say the cake was baked by me, that one right there, not the brownies, not the muffins, not the bread, the cake was baked by me.
And you don't always have to include that second noun in this whole process. You can do something like, the cake was baked before the power went out, before this other stuff happened. The cookies are still dough, but the cake was already baked. And that is still passive voice, and it helps remove some of the confusion. Instead of saying, I baked the cake before the power went out, you remove an element that is unnecessary. If you don't want to emphasize the person doing the thing, but the action itself, then you can use the passive voice when you want the result over the actor. So the wedding cake was baked by the maid of honor. The cake is the more important part of this, not necessarily the maid of honor, though that is an interesting piece of information to still include.
Also, if you want to emphasize that particular action, the baking, passive voice can be super helpful. Like we mentioned earlier, how there's this weird emphasis on the verb, use that to your advantage. So we can say something like 12 cakes were baked in 24 hours. Cakes were baked is going to be the passive. There's an implied baked by somebody, but the action is the important part there.
It can also help soften the blow of the words within dialogue. This will have to be an intentional choice based on the voice of the character, but within dialogue, the cake is not to be eaten is more gentle than the command, don't eat the cake.
So you can say, Grandma's going to say, well, that's not what the cake is for. The cake is not to be eaten, just to be admired. And then Dad would be the one stepping in and going, don't eat the cake. You are telling the reader the same thing, but the characters are telling each other different moods because of the active or passive voice.
The active voice in this particular case comes across as a lot more accusatory, like, I know you're going to eat it, so don't, rather than just a general heads up, hey, the cake is not food.
And the last possible use for passive voice is because of the weirdness of English itself. We like having that extra noun in there, the actor, even if it doesn't make sense that there is an actor there. So when we say something like, it was raining all day, We don't need to necessarily have that second noun that is the actor in order to make this sentence viable, but you kind of have to drop into passive voice in order to make it verbally make sense.
So instead of having to say something like, rain fell from the sky all day, because that's active voice, you can turn rain into a verb and just say, it was raining. The unknown it is non-existent, but it creates that noun in a sentence so you don't have to be super verbose just to say it was raining.
There are a lot of authors who dance around this rule and make their lives so much more difficult because of it. They step out of that conversational language because this is a rule that my editor says I have to follow. And we end up with a weird rain fell from the sky all day. Do what feels right, and if a sentence feels awkward, check that it's not in passive voice. Because the passive voice can be doing harm to your story, but it can also really help your story. It's kind of like cinnamon. It can be used really well or really poorly depending on the rest of the context.
Just be very intentional about it. Pick when you want to use it, when you don't want to use it. Don't accidentally use passive voice because that tends to be your weakest option when it is accidental. Be active in your own way of writing, and of course,
write selfishly.
If you have a question or comment for our hosts or a topic you'd like us to cover, send us an email at writingroots@aspenhousepublishing.com or find us on Facebook by searching for Aspen House Publishing.